This past weekend, France's National Front staged what it billed as a rebranding, a party conference where nearly a year after faltering in the second round of the presidential election, it changed the party name and announced it was kicking out its honorary president, the unabashedly far-right Jean-Marie Le Pen. But the rebranding only went so far.
Let them call you racist.
Laissez-vous appeler raciste.
Let them call you xenophobes.
Mais laissez-vous appeler xénophobes.
Let them call you nativist.
Laissez-vous les appeler nativistes.
Wear it as a badge of honor, because every day we get stronger and they get weaker.
Yeah, you may have recognized Donald Trump's former White House advisor, Steve Bannon, concluding a tour of Europe that also saw him campaign for Italy's far-right Liga and sit down with Germany's anti-immigrant, anti-EU AfD party leadership, the provocations of a die-in-the-wool provocateur? Or is it really, as Bannon suggests, the rise of a transatlantic far-right alliance? Does his brand help or hurt Marion Le Pen with mainstream voters? A year ago, after Emmanuel Macron's win and the ousting of Bannon from the White House more recently, some may have predicted that the alt-right would return to the fringe. But that was before a string of electoral successes for the far-right in Germany, in Austria, and now in Italy. Today in the France 24 debate, we're discussing Bannon on tour. And with us, Laurent Jacobelli, Communications Director for the National Front. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also with us, Ruth Ben-Artzi, visiting fellow at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, and teaches political science at Providence College. Thank you for being with us. From Brussels, Nicholas Vineker, editor of Politico Europe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And communications consultant François Chardon is with us as well.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. High stakes at that conference where Bannon spoke. It was in the northern French city of Lille. He came at what was billed as a crucial and pivotal conference for the National Front. Peter O'Neill has more.
This weekend, Marion Le Pen rebranded the National Front.
I propose that the National Front become the National Rally.
This divided reactions from Marion Le Pen's supporters to former party royalty.
For me, it's good, clean, dignified and respectable.
If this is simply to change the National Front's name, I'm very hesitant.
In her closing speech, Le Pen tread a line between advocating a more palatable brand for the party and the fiery nationalism it's known for.
The name National Front has a glorious history. But you know it is, for many people, a psychological red flag.
This is the latest touch to the party's makeover, a continuing effort to recover from Le Pen's resounding loss to Emmanuel Macron in last year's election. The changes aren't all cosmetic. Le Pen also revoked her father Jean-Marie Le Pen's title of honorary president for life and barred him from attending the Congress. Since taking over, Marion Le Pen has tried to scrub out the party's racist image while keeping their anti-immigration agenda. But another rift may be forming in the family. It's speculated Marion Maréchal-Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's niece, is eyeing up her aunt's job. A new scandal shows the party has considerable bloodletting left to do. Davy Rodriguez, deputy director of the National Front's youth wing, was suspended after a video emerged of him allegedly using racial slurs. A mixed forecast then, but the same leader for now. Marine Le Pen was elected to a new term as president at the Congress, the only candidate.
Laurent Jacobelli, you saw in that report, militants, some of them for, some of them against this changing of the name of the party. What about you? How do you feel about it?
I'm 100% sure we have to change names. As Marine Le Pen explains, there is a psychological barrier for lots of French people, French citizens, to vote for Front National or to be part of Front National. Why? Because media, TV, press has said since decades that Front National was racist, whatever you want. And even if it is wrong, even if it is a fake news, people associate Front National to bad words, bad values, bad things. It's not the truth.
Is it just a change of name?
No, of course not.
Or is it a change in policy for the party?
It's a change in policy, and of course it's a change of names. National rally, it's probably the best translation we can have in English. You have national, which is very important for us, because we are the party of the nation, the only one defending the French nation. And it's a rally because we cannot win alone, especially with the French political system. We have to find partners, like Rise France from Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, like people from Les Républicains, and like people from everywhere. We want to defend our nation against globalism. So it was a great moment because you said that people were not sure to be willing to change names. But if you see the pictures, 100% of people in the room were applauding Marion Le Pen when she said she wanted to rebrand the party. It means we will probably have a big success by asking people if we have to change names.
Nicholas Vineker, same product, different name, or is the party changing?
I think the thing we have to keep in mind is that the main feature of this party, which is its family structure, the leadership by Le Pen is staying the same. That's what the French will remember. People will remember the association with Jean-Marie Le Pen, a Holocaust skeptic. That's why the National Front is considered a dangerous or fringe party, not because of its name. And until the party changes its leadership, that association is going to change. I think that the name change is cosmetic. I think there are some policy adjustments that will happen a bit too late for the presidential election. But I think there's going to be some softening of the line on Europe and on the euro, which were very slow in coming, but now we've arrived there.
So softening on the euro?
No, of course not.
Because we saw it with the far right in Italy, no longer calling for a referendum to leave the euro. Is it the same with the National Front, where now the euro, you accept it stays?
I will tell you something just to react to what has been said about this family political party. We are probably one of the most democratic party in France. Marine Le Pen was candidate to be re-elected president. No one wanted to...
Right, but it's fact that since 1972, the leaders of the party have all been called Le Pen.
But democratically elected, which is a big difference of lots of other parties.
And on this issue of the euro?
Our members have voted. They say euro is not the priority to change France. The first priority for France is to have borders again, borders to fight against massive immigration, borders to protect our companies, our firms, and borders to live in security. That's the priority our members have told us, and as a democratic movement, it is what we will put on number one on the list.
François Chardon, is France's right and far right, are they changing after this presidential election where you have this newcomer, Emmanuel Macron, that's sort of sucked all the air from the center-right and the center-left?
There's clearly a shift in politics since this election, and I think we've seen that in the defection of Philippot from the Front National, for instance. We've seen that in the departure of Marion Maréchal-Le Pen, officially from politics. But it's striking to see this our presence at the CPAC, where
we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Steve Bannon is unwelcome, but Marion Maréchal-Le Pen is. So it's a notion of what is conservatism today, and in terms of branding for the Front National, I think the strongest brand indeed is Le Pen, and this brand is very very much parasited both by the father of Marine Le Pen and by the Marion Maréchal.
By the niece. Ruth Ben-Artzi, that brings us to the topic of Steve Bannon. What was your reaction when you saw him at that conference this weekend?
I guess I was surprised, but he probably has just more time on his hands, so he's traveling around the world and giving advice. But I think, set that aside, I think this whole notion of America First, the nationalism, or what he calls populism, which I don't agree with. I don't think it's populism at all. I think to take it on a tour across the world actually shows a completely different trend. It shows a trend that is a global trend. And it is embracing globalism because it's essentially saying, okay, let's take this ideology and marry it with all like ideologies in other countries that are willing to that have those same kind of what I call very extreme right wing political parties.
All right, the party's founder, Jean-Marie Le Pen, whose days at the party are numbered, if his daughter has her way, was asked about Bannon showing up and speaking. Here's what he had to say.
I have a lot of sympathy for Steve Bannon, but he's not exactly the definition of mainstream.
Yeah, does it sort of undermine the idea of being more mainstream when you invite a Steve Bannon who says, let them call you racist, wear it as a badge of honor?
We don't feel we have to be mainstream for the media. We have to be mainstream in the sense we have to win the elections, it is to say, having partners and so on. But what Steve Bannon says, in fact, it is to say that nowadays you have two ways to think politics. The first one, which is very up-to-date, especially in France, is globalism. You are no longer an individual, a citizen. You are no longer a father or mother. You are just a consumer and a worker. So there is a kind of nomadism possible. It is to say you belong to no country, you belong to everywhere. You just have to work for a company and let this company make money. That's one way to see the world. And another one is our way. It's probably Donald Trump's way. It's what happens in Italy, in Austria, within the Visegrad group in Eastern Europe. It is to say nation is important. A citizen, a human being has roots. He has a family, he has a history, he has a culture. And without that, he is no longer a human being. And we want to put the human being in the center, in the heart of our politics. That's probably the common point with Steve Bannon.
Nicholas Vineker, this conference is a rebranding conference. Marion Le Pen talking about going more mainstream. Inviting Steve Bannon, did that help or hurt her cause?
It's an odd choice to make. This is not a party that's known for its love of the United States. The father was more interested in the Reagan administration. Marion Le Pen has shown very little interest, aside from a few words she said about Donald Trump during the U.S. presidential election, and rapport has been ambiguous. So you bring this figure on. He's a celebrity of a sort of populist nativism. I'm not sure it's the greatest electoral argument inside France. I'm not sure how well known this person is. What I would say is I dispute the notion that Steve Bannon made that this was a global movement. Let's remember that since Brexit and since Trump's election, there have been elections in the Netherlands, in France, and in Austria. In all three places, the populist nativist candidate did lose in a free and fair open election. And we'll see how the coalition turns out in Italy. But I would argue that the forces of so-called the nation are not going to end up prevailing in this situation either. So I think this idea that there's a populist wave washing over the world, well, it hasn't washed over quite yet.
Perhaps not washing over the world, Nicholas, but when you have Steve Bannon going to visit all people from all these political parties that sit together, by the way, at the European Parliament, what does that tell you about the way the different sides are lining up on the global stage?
I think there's always been a desire to show places where we meet, rallies where we come together. There's a conference in Vienna. People will meet elsewhere. But remember, the defining feature of these parties is that the nation and the nation is what counts most. They're not internationalist movements, and it's not in their instinct to be international or to coordinate things on a global scale. Remember that Steve Bannon's media outlet, Breitbart, announced that it was going to launch European editions everywhere. It said it was going to start a website in France and help Marion Le Pen win the election. Well, they could never find anyone to write in French for them, and the project was abandoned. Internationalism is not in these people's playbook, and I would not look beyond the stage moment or the kind of hype around Steve Bannon's visit for any sort of deep coalition here.
Ruth Ben-Artzi, you agree?
Yes, I actually agree with that. And I don't agree with the notion that Steve Bannon brings kind of like this new wind and new energy to the Front National, because he was very unsuccessful in the United States. He was successful in helping Trump get elected and creating chaos, but he lost his job. He doesn't have any support. He lost his job at Breitbart. His financial supporters or backers have not backed him. He's not a very likable person in the United States.
But you could make the counter-argument that he succeeded in consolidating a core following for Donald Trump.
He has, but look at who these followers are. I think that there's a misperception about who these followers are. These followers are not those people who have lost their identity because they are just labeled as workers. These followers of Donald Trump actually are the people who are happy about the tax cuts, for example, are the elites, are the wealthy people, are the bankers. They're actually not the people who the populist, as populism is traditionally defined, would want to speak to. Those backers of Donald Trump are the people who are enjoying the global economy. Even with all his rhetoric, the things that he did most, his biggest achievements in office so far have been to deregulate the economy, have been to cut regulation, to cut taxes. He's talked about renegotiating NAFTA. He's talking about tariffs now, but these things are not necessarily going to pan out. And he's so far following pretty traditional Republican conservative ideology.
The future is unwritten, or has Steve Bannon and his ideology gone as far as they can go?
I think in a way, it's not clear right now that the American administration has divorced the idea that Steve Bannon is defending. I mean, the notion of a trade war seems very much attuned to his ideology. And in that sense, I would agree to disagree. But otherwise, I think it's fair to say that he is presenting himself as learning from European populism, and he feels that the Italian elections have brought wind to his populist sails. But we'll see how far this goes. What is true is that the discourse of populism is now going mainstream. And you could argue, for instance, that there are many flavors of populism in the current majorities across Europe.
All right, and a lot of the discussion, we'll talk about it when we come back. We'll take a very quick break, is also about tactics that the populists use. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Steve Bannon's tour of Europe, which took him to places like Italy, Switzerland, and to France, where this weekend the National Front staged a rebranding conference, renaming the party. With us to talk about, Laurent Jacobelli, communications director of what's still called, for the time being, until it's formally approved, the National Front. Thank you for being with us. Thanks as well to political scientist Ruth Ben-Artzi, visiting fellow at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, from Brussels, Nicholas Vineker, editor of Politico.eu, and communications consultant François Chardon. François Chardon mentioning how a couple of weeks back it wasn't Marine Le Pen, but her niece, Marion Maréchal-Le Pen, addressing the big annual CPAC conference that draws thousands of U.S. conservatives to Washington.
I'm not offended when I hear President Donald Trump say America first. In fact, I want America first for the American people. I want Britain first for the British people. And I want France first for the French people.
Ruth Ben-Artzi, hearty applause there, and this is not some fringe element here. This is the Republican Party, conservatives who are applauding her.
Right. I think that it sounds great, but I think when you try to kind of when we translate it into real world policies, it just does not make sense, because the big problems that we're tackling.
But is there a shift in U.S. policy? I mean, U.S. politics, excuse me.
Right now, I'm not seeing this yet. They applauded her because it sounds good, because this is the slogan that Trump has run on of America First. But in fact, much of his foreign policy has not shifted that as much as people would have thought that it would have shifted during the elections. He tries to tweak it here and there, but America depends on trade. America depends on, and as the international community. Our companies, our firms are all global. They're international. They have workers and they have offices across the world. The environment, disease, everything. It's all our big problems are actually global problems. So saying America first, France first, Britain first, it sounds great, but I'm not really sure what it means.
Nicholas Vinegar, what did you make of Marion Maréchal-Le Pen being invited to Washington?
She's a political star in France, and she had been anointed a while ago, if you recall, by Steve Bannon, who said he'd be happy to work with her. Then they sort of lost each other's telephone number and never made that happen. But she's been on the radar. She's untainted by any loss. And she's clearly a telegenic person who was given star billing at this conference. Beyond that, it was also great for her politically. She's taken a step back and let her aunt deal with some of the damage control from the presidential election, and she's putting herself into pole position to have some leadership role in the future. As for her message, well, what I would say is if you have America first and Britain first and France first, that means that everybody is competing and everybody is clashing with one another, and trade clashes turn into wars. And, that's how we started out the last century. It didn't turn out too well.
Laurent Jacobelli?
I'm amazed. I'm puzzled. How can we say that globalism today, for France, for instance, what is it? It's that a French citizen working hard, paying his taxes, being French legally, living legally in France, it is possible for him to earn less monthly than a migrant family coming illegally in France. Do you think that this is acceptable? Do you think that when we do this statement, it is not logical just after that, with good sense, to say French people first in France, France first for French people, and the same for Italy, and the same for Austria, and the same for Poland, and the same for the United States? It doesn't mean we live alone. It doesn't mean we don't want to negotiate, to trade with others. We want rules adapted to our citizens. For instance,
because there's a big fear, for instance, with the steel tariffs that Donald Trump is imposing, that it'll mean a steel glut for here in Europe, and that it will hurt the steel industry on this continent.
You're right. But if 20 years ago we did have the same decision, the same measure as Donald Trump is doing today in the United States, our steel industry will still go on hiring people. We didn't dare to do it, and that's the key point. So what I mean is protecting our people, French citizens, is the goal of the French representatives, or should be. It's no longer.
François Chardon, just to remind our viewers, there is a difference on policy between Marine Le Pen and her niece, Marion Maréchal-Le Pen. Marine Le Pen, who has tacked to a more in favor of social policies, like the old, like in the past, the left had, and she won a lot of votes in Rust Belt parts because of that. Marion Maréchal-Le Pen, much more free market.
Yes, I think there's a great gap between the two in economic policy, even though it's been put right now in the shadow, because officially Marion Maréchal Le Pen is taking a step back. And by the way, I think it's a strange way to take a step back to go to the CPAC, because it's clearly a political rally, even if it's abroad. And she looked very much like a candidate presenting a platform more than someone who's pushing for an education project in academia.
He clearly, Steve Bannon, has a preference for Marion Maréchal Le Pen. Nicholas Vinegar saying how he singled her out for praise in that tweet right after the election, saying at this conference over the weekend he regards Marine Le Pen's niece as one of the most impressive people in the entire world, and I can only see great things in her future. Is he favoring Marion over Marine?
I don't think so. I think you can have a good judgment on two different people. He likes Marion, why not? She is very talented. But you have probably noticed that he came to our conference to talk to our members of party, and he was here, he was feeling good, he had a good speech, and he came to see us and say, what we did in the United States, you can do it in France. So I guess he likes us a little bit, no? And he likes Marine Le Pen. You know, that's very strange. When something is happening and going well, it is the case here because Steve Bannon came, did a speech, was applause and everything. You just see the little things that could go wrong and say, you see, he prefers the niece of Marine Le Pen. No, don't go into that. You can like two different people who have good relationships with Marion, and don't try to find issues when there isn't.
Nicholas Vinegar, are we reading too much into his remarks of praise for Marion Maréchal Le Pen?
I think it's fair to take the man at what he said. He could have come out during the French election with a clear endorsement of the National Front of Marine Le Pen. Let me remind people watching that Donald Trump's campaign refused any direct contact with Marine Le Pen or the National Front during the duration of his presidential campaign. There was no question of being associated or seen in public with anyone in this party. She went to Trump Tower and stayed in the lobby. So the fact that Steve Bannon has chosen Marion Maréchal Le Pen, or he did during the election, is significant. Now the man is a free agent. He doesn't have a media wing. He doesn't have a party. He doesn't have anything. He's free to go to any conference he likes and stand on the stage with Marine Le Pen. But when it counted, he stayed far away from her.
Bannon's tour of Europe, by the way, didn't just include France. He campaigned for Matteo Salvini in Italy, the leader of the far-right Liga, who could be a potential prime minister pick. And he had a meeting with Alice Weidel, the German far-right's AfD leader in the Bundestag, the German parliament. The two met in Zurich, where Bannon was speaking at an event about the populist revolts and their global consequences for Switzerland, Europe, and America. This coming just before that speech before the National Front Congress.
It is not about left versus right. That's too simplistic. And it's the way the opposition party media has always kept us out of power. I did not come here as a teacher. I came to Europe as an observer and to learn. And what I've learned is you are part of a worldwide movement that is bigger than France, bigger than Italy, bigger than Hungary, bigger than all of it. And history is on our side.
François Charnon, a worldwide movement he talks about there. And by the way, Bannon wasn't just a student because, according to the German news agency DPA, when he sat down with the leader of the AfD in the German parliament, she was there to get advice on how to handle PR and media.
Well, he's suddenly a freelancer now, so I guess he can also bring his advice. And I think he's been probably more involved in the Brexit campaign that this statement would hint. I think he was clearly in touch with Nigel Farage whom he describes as a dear friend. But the fact of the matter is, frequently the people he has been in touch are not in charge now. If you take UKIP now, they're not part of the government in the UK, and so in Germany, clearly Merkel, de Grosco, excludes, of course, AfD.
It excludes the AfD, but the AfD, which has made strong inroads. Nicholas Vineker, listening to Steve Bannon's remarks, do you get the sense when you compare the election cycle of 2017 and that of 2018 that winds could be changing in Europe?
It's difficult to say. Politics move. And one thing that happens is that the mainstream parties or the conservative or left-wing absorb a lot of the campaign issues that have been raised by the populist far right, or however you want to call them. Immigration, asylum, all these things have been assimilated by conservative parties, and they've changed their attitude on a lot of these issues. Europe has toughened its borders, has changed its attitude toward migration significantly since 2015, which was the year that started this cycle in Europe. And I think that's not to be neglected. And I would also just object to another assertion he made, that this is a worldwide movement. I would challenge him to say, how is it worldwide? Where is the worldwide Congress when you have a movement where it's each country for themselves? There's nothing worldwide about that. It's it's nationalism, which we've seen before, and that's where I challenge Steve Bannon and his supporters to point out where is the international aspect of this movement beyond a meeting in France or at CPAC that's a novelty beyond anything else.
Laurent Jacobelli, you agree it's not a worldwide movement?
I hope for this journalist that Mr. Macron will never take any measure against fake news, because he will probably be no longer able to do his job. Because when he says that, for instance, French or European politicians have taken decision against immigration, it's surprising, because you probably noticed that, for instance, in France, 2017 has been the year of all the records in matter of immigration. It's now a big wave of immigration arriving in France, with insecurity, with welfare.
There's far fewer immigrants coming in than in 2015 and 2016.
What I mean is the people arriving into Europe. In 2015, there was 1 million people accepted into Germany.
Sorry, I don't care. I care about France.
And yes, that's what I meant before you accused me of fake news. Thank you.
Yes. The second one is it's not an internationalism of populism, as he said, but I don't like this word. But no, of course. But in each country, people defending the nation are getting more and more votes. In the United States, which is obviously a big country with Donald Trump. In Italy, with Matteo Salvini, who was also giving a message to attendant of our conference. You didn't say it, but he was here, and he will be probably the next Prime Minister of Italy. With FPO in Austria being part of the government, with countries, you never quote them, with what group, who are Eurosceptics and who are defending the nation. So in Great Britain, of course. So probably there is not worldwide in every country a movement, but we can notice that the major countries of the world are now defending the nation.
Is one of the major differences between Steve Bannon and all the parties that you've mentioned the fact that Bannon had his falling out with Donald Trump over Russia, where Bannon did not agree with his boss over how to handle Vladimir Putin, whereas all the parties that you mentioned there have warm ties with Vladimir Putin, including yours?
No, I guess that we are not in the same situation of like the United States. We are friends, and we see Russia at National Front as a partner. not as an enemy. And frankly, we have to thank Mr. Putin to have get us rid of some of jihadists who were in North Africa. And not the United States did kill them, not France. Mr. Putin did. So we have to get good relationships with him.
But hang on, it was the French who intervened in Mali to push the jihadists out.
Yeah, in Mali, but not in Syria or not in Iraq.
Ruth Ben-Artzi, when you see it, the way things are unfolding, what are your thoughts on the way Europe is going with the way alliances are changing and shifting?
Well, I think that there is obviously a reaction to, first of all, to the financial crisis of 2008, and then the crisis in Syria and other crises around the Middle East and North Africa that have produced more waves of immigration into Europe. And I think that reaction, and this is not unlike what we've seen in the 20th century, as was said before, that reaction creates a wave of ultranationalism, which is, we've seen that before. In the 21st century, I don't think it's going to go so far. I really don't think that. I think that those policies are not going to be policies that are going to be successful, that will hold, because I think they can't deliver for those populations, for those people who are electing those public officials, those who are voting for those far-right nationalist parties. And I don't think they're populist. I think they're nationalist far-right parties. They're not going to be satisfied with what they see if those parties are in power, because they're not going to. They won't be able to achieve their promises. They are thriving on creating a sense of fear. They're thriving on creating hatred. They're thriving on creating on tapping into people's insecurities. But that can't last very long. It might be destructive. It might create more strife. But I don't think it's going to last very long.
At one point during his remarks, Steve Bannon called on the militants to boo the press. And we've seen it's not just the far-right National Front that talks about fake news. The leader of the Conservative Party in France, Les Républicains, the new leader, he also says, discard what the media is saying, what the mainstream media is saying. In that respect, are politics changing for good in terms of?
I think that's a trend that has come across many feathers in French politics for a while. We've seen that with President Sarkozy, and we've seen that more recently with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's been hammering the media pretty hard.
So he created his own YouTube channel so that people would...
and then apparently applying strange HR policies.
But Nicholas Winokur, when Steve Bannon asks the National Front Congress to boo the media, is it just a bit of grandstanding, or does that have serious consequences?
I think it's an exceptionally dangerous precedent. Let's recall that the media is supposed to play a role in a functioning democracy. In the United States, we say it's the fifth pillar. It's there to keep public officials to account, and that's why we hope that it's free and available to everybody. When you turn a crowd on the media, you are turning a crowd on freedom of speech. And I would just like to remind people where fake news comes from. Fake news, Donald Trump did not invent the term fake news. We invented it to talk about disinformation that was created in Russian troll farms and used to divide the American electorate. Donald Trump adopted the term and flipped it on its head, reversed it, and use it against its enemies, and it's been taken up by autocrats, dictators the world over to describe media coverage and opinions that they don't like. That's my issue with the fake news and the booing of the press. Why boo? Have an argument, have a discussion. But I don't boo a political candidate. I don't insult. I don't name names. I take a measured position, and that's the level that political discourse should be at. Not booing, not crowds against the media.
All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But I want to thank Nicholas Winokur in Brussels. I want to thank Laurent Jacobelli,
thank you,
as well as François Chardon, Ruth Ben-Artzi. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello. Stay with us. We're almost done, but not quite. Say hello to James Creedon. How are you?
Francois. Good. So lots of comment since the weekend on Steve Bannon's appearance alongside Marion Le Pen.
Was it the top bill in the French press? Bannon's presence, or the Congress in and of itself?
Well, certainly I think Bannon's presence drew even more attention to the coverage of the Congress, and certainly some of his choice expressions made it into headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's take a look at The Guardian. Steve Bannon tells French far-right history is on our side. So very much this attempt to depict it all as a wave that they are riding along together. USA Today with this headline, "Tell them, call you racists," Bannon tells far-right party. And we saw indeed that, as USA Today points out, that the one-time White House strategist, who is often credited with helping Trump win the presidency in 2016, told them to ride the tide of history and it will compel us to victory after victory after victory. The Washington Post writing, this went up online just a couple of hours ago, so still comment 48 hours later. Bannon encouraging a populist to embrace racist label confirms belief about worldview he brought to the White House. And it goes on to say that this confirms his critics' belief that the worldview that he brought to the White House is quite simply rooted in racism. So that's the point of view coming out of one of the major dailies in the US. Also, we saw just prior to this Congress in Lille that he had been in Italy. He's been courting various far-right parties across Europe, and indeed the New York Times writing from Milan about this. This headline, I think, says a lot. It's Steve Bannon is done wrecking the American establishment. Now he wants to destroy Europe's. Now, what they point.
I saw that piece, and this wasn't an editorial comment. This was in a standard news piece.
Right. It was just the headline is highly editorialized, I guess, but certainly the content is just reporting on what happened. And I think one of the more interesting pieces in the content is the fact that he's working on a project to create a think tank to weaponize populist economic and social ideas. And there was, plans that we heard already about last year and even the previous year to spread Breitbart news into various European countries. Now, that doesn't seem to be happening in France just yet, despite the fact that it was announced early last year. This is an article from February 2017 in Le Monde saying no Breitbart news in France for at least a few months. Now, we're over a year later and those plans don't seem to have advanced very far. And certainly in the meantime, we've heard that Emmanuel Macron has plans to clamp down on his definition of fake news. Of course, everybody having their own definition of fake news for now, some obviously more accurate than others. But certainly that is the plan. That is the master plan, if you like, or the broader strategy. And as it says in the New York Times, that he wants these populist websites, either owned by him or others, to spread these ideas under his guidance.
The National Front doesn't have a media per se. Would you be in favour of having a media outlet that is officially sanctioned by your party?
We are working on it.
You're working on it?
Yes, of course, because we see that the traditional media will never be covering us as they should. We were talking about bullying as a journalist and the press. I am not, but I have some good arguments. For instance, can you imagine that the Front National has only 5% of the speech time on the public media? 5%. We were ranking number 2 at the presidential election, and 11 million people did vote for us. Can you call it a democracy?
François Chardon, do you have the sense that the National Front is underreported on and their spokespeople get less airtime?
I think there's been probably less airtime since the election, but during the election, the balance was controlled by, I think, CSR,
State Broadcast Authority.
Yeah.
So 5%.
And I think this past weekend, all of the major rolling news channels in France carried a lot of the speeches live. I'm not sure that would have been the case 5 or 10 years ago, that party congresses got full live coverage on rolling news channels. So certainly for the Congress, I think there was a lot of coverage on French and rolling news channels. Whether or not that balances out.
You're right, but always trying to find the small history putting some bad news on us. So
we can continue the discussion. But I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you, James, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.